morning, good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming here. As chairperson of the ASCL Research Assembly, it gives me really great pleasure to welcome you to the 7th annual lecture of the African Studies Center in memory of the late Professor Stephen Ellis. In particular, I welcome, of course, our guest Nanjala, Nyabola, our speaker of today. I'll talk more on her in a minute. And I also welcome Professor Gerrit de Haar, Stephen Ellis's partner. Also, of course, our director, Marleen Dekker. And online, hopefully, our past director, Professor Jan Bart-Gewalt, who resigned earlier this year. Presenting this annual lecture is my last function as chair of this research assembly, as I'm handing over next month to my dear colleague, Dr. Akinjinka Akinyuade. I hope he's online. So, and therefore, I want to take this opportunity to express my personal gratitude to Jan Bart-Gewalt as a former director. He changed his position this year. I want to thank him for his collegial and intense scientific commitment to the African Studies Center for African Studies that he has shown in the course of his years as director. So, Jan Bart, I hope you are online. Thank you. I would like to first now give the floor to our new director, Marleen Dekker. Please, Marleen, for a welcome.
Yep. Thank you very much, Jan. Welcome all of you who are here, which is a very restricted group because of the current circumstances, and welcome to all of you online. Indeed, to the 7th annual Stephen Ellis annual lecture. And as Jan already alluded to, the Africa Studies Center organizes this annual lecture in honor of our late colleague. In honor, on the one hand, for the great scholar that he was, but also to encourage others to work in his spirit, if you like. And with this 7th edition of the lecture, this lecture has now truly become a tradition for the African Studies Center. A tradition that I, as the new director, am very proud of, but personally, I'm also very fond of this tradition. And I share that with Gerrit already this afternoon. So why do I like a lecture, the annual lecture like this? Because in the speakers and the topics that are covered in the Stephen Ellis lecture, they always invite very much space for intellectual reflection. Reflection, and I'm sure that many of you will agree, that is so needed in this particular time and in this particular context. And here I refer, of course, to the current global pandemic, the increases in inequality that we have witnessed, the ecological challenges that we as humankind face, in a time that global solidarity is increasingly under pressure. And at these times, I think personally, but also as an institute and with invited speakers, it is very important to reflect. And therefore, I'm really proud that tonight we have Dr. Nanjala Nyabola to take us along in this reflection. And I would like to thank both Jan and Gerrit for inviting her to do so. Thank you very much. I'm looking forward.
Thank you, Marleen. So, as this is the lecture in honor of Stephen Ellis, it might interest you to get an update of the work done on the extensive personal archive of Stephen Ellis, which is housed at the African Studies Center. And for this, I would like to give the floor to our head of library and vice director, Jos Damen, who has been guiding the documentation and description of this archive. And don't forget, talking about the library, don't forget to check out the web dossier on the topic of the lecture, which has been prepared by the library staff and with an introduction by Loes Oldenhuis, who's also here. Yeah. So, Jos, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. The library is proud to have several archives. None of the archives is as large as that of Stephen Ellis. It is more than 10 meters, and it's a real research archive. One of the PhDs at the ASC, Tycho van der Hoog, has been busy for a few months already to make an inventory of this archive. And it's an immense task because he really wants to have a very good detailed description of the archive. The inventory is now 150 pages and still not finished. And the inventory is also a reflection of the very broad interest, of the very broad topics that Stephen always was interested in. If I may guide you through the draft inventory, I see on page, on chapter 2.1, Charles Taylor, 1996-2003. On page 4, files A to K, France in Madagascar, pre-1895. And then 2.3.4, internet fraud, the 419 cases. On 2.5.2, ANC 1960s. 2.5.16, Operation Lark. 2.5.26, Vito Palazzolo, Mafia in Africa. And 4.2, arms trade. So, and this is 4.14, migration. This is only a very short, I just picked some of the details from the inventory that's getting shaped now. The inventory will be published hopefully next year and is very helpful for researchers. I remember Stephen vividly. He was always keen on finding new topics and finding interesting archives. I remember him sometimes tipping him off that an old archive in London for the Foreign Office was now opened, and within a few weeks he was there and always discovering new stuff. I really think of him as one of the persons who understood that archives are very special in a way that researchers can find things that they will never find anywhere else. And with that, I would like to say to everyone, we have already had people coming in or asking us, do you have anything on this topic in that archive? We're always willing to look, and we're always willing to help you and guide you through this very special archive consisting of more than 10 meters archival papers. And we love it. And we thank Gerry very much for giving us the trust and the opportunity to work on that. So if I may show you, these are the cases, and then imagine 10 meters of this. And if you open, I just opened one case, and you see a small leaflet like this coming out from Chris Hani, about Chris Hani, and several papers in there. It's a wonderful treasure trove, and I hope that we can share these treasure troves from the ASC library with as many researchers as possible. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Great. So as Marlene already noticed, it has been again an eventful and challenging year for us and for university life as a whole, of course, in large part due to this pandemic. And really the point you raised about solidarity needed globally with Africa. We should, as African scholars, insist on distributional issues and on reconnecting partnerships to get vaccines and medical issues to Africa much more than is now the case. It also underlines the relevance of African studies, highlighting the need for this. So we as scholars and as an institution keep on insisting on it. Anyway, we are very fortunate to have as our speaker Nyabola in person, so not virtually, thank God. And that she is here today is really due in large part to the efficient support and efforts of Rick Jongeleier. Communication officer. Thank you really, Rick, for this. No, I go to the main program. The annual lecture is given by a prominent figure active on African studies, who can speak to both an academic as well as a general audience about thought-provoking scientific and wider social intellectual issues regarding Africa and the world. And we really are happy, I personally, and everybody is really happy to have you, Nanjala, here today. You combine these two aspects of intellectual academic focus and achievements, as well as having you the appeal to a large audience of African issues in a very engaging, I would say, really sparkling manner. You are a independent writer and researcher based in Nairobi. You have worked on the intersection between technology, media, and society, as well as on identity and gender issues and on other social cultural issues regarding Africa in the global setting, Africa in the global setting. You have just a few background issues, things on her from her vita. You have 2 MScs from Oxford in African Studies as well as in forced migration. You have a JD from Harvard Law School, and you have had many research positions. It's really an impressive list: IDI, ODI in Britain, CIGI in Waterloo, Canada, and the Oxford Internet Institute. And you have worked on a range of other human rights and other projects across the world. She has published in several academic journals, including African Security Review, Women's Studies Quarterly, and did chapters for many edited collections as well as international publications. And your book, Digital Democracy and Politics, that is really what fascinates me really. I use it in teaching. The book about how the internet era is transforming politics in Kenya. It's a pioneer work on politics and the impact of digital media. Pioneer work. Your recent book, Traveling While Black, Essays Inspired by a Life on the Move, it explores a whole new range of issues regarding human migration, human mobility, globalization, traveling, and cultural encounter. I hope it has a big impact because you raised all kinds of interesting, new, unexpected questions, and really it's marked by a striking originality. In 2018, you co-edited the book Where Women Are, Gender and the 2017 Kenyan Elections, which hints at the subject of your lecture today, African Feminism as Method. I propose that after the lecture, which will take about maybe 45 minutes, okay, we'll have a question and answer round with the audience, both the people here present as well as online. So as you have all the abstract for the lecture, I will now really shut up and give Nanjala the floor.
Sorry. I'm told I can take off my mask the next time it's not. Okay. First of all, how is it?
Okay.
Very good. I'm really excited to be here today. As you heard, my name is Nanjala. I wear very many hats. I do very many different things. And one of the things that has happened, I've done in my past undergrad degree in African Studies and Political Science at the University of Birmingham, which is where I first encountered Stephen Ellis's work. I read The Mask of Anarchy in my 3rd year at Birmingham. And I remember receiving this book and just having a very profound experience with it, because the thing with African studies is it was very rooted in anthropology and very much rooted in a slightly different way of thinking. And I was thinking about contemporary politics and elections and things like that. And the political science department was very much rooted in European politics and the EU and borders and all of that stuff. And I was the only person in the university doing this program. So I was moving through these departments, going from one framework to the other, and struggling, right? Struggling to find a place that made sense for how I wanted to see the world, which is beyond disciplines and beyond all of these unspoken lines that exist that say when you do European political science, you can only read these people. And when you do African political science, you can only read these people. And I remember reading The Mask of Anarchy and thinking, this is a really interesting way of thinking about conflict, because it looks at how people behave and ascribes rationality to things that everybody around had been saying was completely irrational and completely didn't make any sense and it's completely violent. So it was an interesting encounter. I read Stephen again when I was living in Madagascar. It was the only English book that I could find that was written about Madagascar. At the time, my French wasn't that good. And so I'm very happy to be here today. And I hope that the lecture or that the conversation that we have here today kind of informs your own work and informs your own thinking about some of these issues. I'm not an expert. I want to say that up front. I don't like to think of myself as an expert. What I like to say is that I am building an intellectual practice. And I'm building an intellectual practice that is fueled by love as a political and as a social value. that is fueled by curiosity about how the world works and about how different societies interact with each other. And thinking about making the world a better place for current and future generations, as well as thinking creatively and constructively and really respectfully about our relationship with the natural environment. And trying to bring all those things together into a way of understanding the world and experiencing the world and sharing the knowledge of the world with other people. So why am I here today? Well, I'm here to talk about some of the ideas that have emerged during the course of trying to shape this intellectual practice. As you heard, much like Stephen, move across thematic concerns, and I try to move across regional concerns, places, ideas, and things like that to try and build a way of thinking about the world that makes sense beyond narrow geographies, beyond narrow concerns about time and about space. Notably, I'm here to share some of the ideas behind the ideas of the work that I've been doing for the last decade and a bit, so that hopefully they can, as I said, inform the work that you're doing and we can continue to build together. Some of what I'm going to say to you today is probably not going to sound very novel and new, but I'm going to say it anyway, because I think resisting the idea that things must be new and we must always be chasing the new is one of the impulses that I'm always trying to critique. Sometimes things are important enough that they need to be verified. They need to be said again and said differently by different people who are experiencing them differently. I think we need to get into the habit of sitting with and grappling with complexity, communicating complexity to lay audiences so that they can also find something useful to do with it. We need to do the boring but necessary work of making knowledge live beyond the walls of academia. By way of background, for the last decade and a half, a big part of the focus of my intellectual energy has been on two things. One, as you heard, the role of technology in society, and two, the contemporary experience of human mobility. Both of those things are rooted in my own lived experiences. I, Kenyan, studied abroad, lived outside Kenya for 11 years. This pandemic is the longest continuous amount of time that I've spent in my home country since I was a teenager. But at the same time, being present in Kenya during the post-election violence of 2007, 2008, and really witnessing the impact that technology had on the outcomes of that particular process and how it's changed Kenyan society since. When I first started to pitch the idea of writing a book about technology in Kenya, I had a lot of very interesting conversations. There was this sense that you had to write about the entire continent. When you write about Africa, it's weird to write about just one country. It has to be bigger than that because technology is a secondary concern. It's not the things that we think about. And you have to keep in mind, this is something that, an idea that started to take shape in 2009. And at the time, I remember one person even said explicitly, these are middle-class concerns. This is not going to be an important issue. And another really interesting conversation I had was, why are you writing nonfiction? You should be writing something like Chimamanda, what Chimamanda is doing. That's what you should be writing. I said, well, I don't write novels and I'm not sure that anybody would want to read a novel that I wrote. So I want to help you understand why I still went ahead with it, even though there was so much incredulity and so much pushback. First, why Kenya, right? Kenya is not the most anything of all of the countries in Africa. We're not the biggest, we're not the wealthiest, don't have the largest population, don't have the most natural resources of anything. If there is one thing that Kenyans are the most at, I would say, we are the fastest. And the Ethiopians can disagree, but it's true. and yet, despite this lack of antecedents, this lack of pre-existing traditions, if you will, how does this country then emerge to be not just in Africa, but really a world leader in the global south in terms of the uptake of technology? How do we become the world leader in mobile money, such that in 2017, mobile money in Kenya accounted for the equivalent of 1/3 of the country's GDP? How do we end up having the second fully digital election in Africa after Namibia in 2014 that ends up being the most expensive election in the world at $28 a head? For contrast, the Indian election costs $1 a head. How is it that we end up being a country that even with only about 1 million Twitter users at the moment, those 1 million Twitter users are so vocal, so coordinated, so loud that they manage to bully their own president off the platform? How does that happen? These are some of the questions that make Kenya interesting to me, because I think what's happening in Kenya, and it has really turned out to be the case, is indicative of some of the trends that are going to happen with technology all over the world. And if you think about it, if I had pitched a book about the United States, if I had written a book about the United States without any reference to any other region in the world about technology, nobody would have questioned it. We are constantly reading information about technology that is grounded in the American experience and is presented as a generalized assessment of the role of technology, and nobody questions it. Why is there this intellectual tension when someone writes about an African country and presents it as a starting point for thinking about general themes in politics and society? So that was part of the thinking behind this book. It wasn't just about Kenya, even though Kenya represents the confluence of all of these interesting energies, but Kenya as a starting point for thinking about what technology is going to look like in our societies over the next 10, 15, 20 years. And the second question, guiding question, is why now? Or at the time, writing about Kenya's first digital decade between 2007 and 2017. The first decade of internet all over the world, maybe not the first decade, but let's say the first 20 years, was characterized by incredible optimism. The internet was going to fix everything, which is why we sent all of our money to digital elections and we spent all of our money building all of these digital ID systems and all of these platforms. I think we're on the cusp of a major shift, or we're in the middle of a major shift in this orientation. Our relationship to technology is on the verge of changing our power dynamics within our societies, between societies, all over the world. Think about digital ID and the impact that it's having on marginalization, where the Indian government, for example, can make over 1 million people stateless in Assam just by virtue of digital ID registration. Think about, as I said, mobile money and financial inclusion. Before the advent of mobile money in Kenya, only 27% of Kenyan adults had access to a bank account. Now we're transacting billions of shillings every year on the platforms. Think about how that changes the public's relationship to money and to financial services. And as I mentioned, social media and politics. It's one thing to laugh when we say that we bullied our president offline, but it's another thing to think about how information is playing out. Information generated on social media is playing out in our real lives. When we think about the 35% of Germans who have refused to get vaccinated and the correlation that has to misinformation that is specifically targeting German-speaking audiences and the size and scope of the problem that they're facing, public health problem that's arisen because of that. Something is happening that we need to be able to understand much better. For me, the process of doing things, the questions behind the questions was, how can I think about technology in a different way? How can I introduce new thematic concerns, new operational, new approaches to thinking about this issue that will generate new questions so that we're not just recycling the tropes of tech optimism, but we're actually asking the urgent questions that will illuminate a new understanding of the role that technology will play in our lives. The central reference object in much of what we read about technology is the white middle-class man who lives in, global north, probably the United States, lately maybe also Europe, because now we're starting to see concerns about language. This reality no longer holds. At the moment, there are 4 billion users of Facebook. If you put India and Brazil together, they constitute about half of that number. None of those users would fit that profile, right? They might be middle class, but they might not be white. Many of them will not be male. Many of them will not speak English as a first language. So our assumptions about who uses technology and what they use technology for have to shift accordingly. Overall, as the demographics and the practices on the internet change, our ontological and epistemological ideas of what the internet is and how it functions and its role in public life will have to shift accordingly. This is why I've spent so much time and energy thinking about this. Not just because the internet is interesting, but because of what the internet says about us and about how our societies will function in the near future. In all of this work, African feminisms have been and remain the guiding light and the key instrument of shaping both the input and the outcomes of my research. They're not just the what and the why, but also the how. And in this talk, I want to specifically focus on African feminisms as a how, as an invitation to imagine a different way of thinking about political science more broadly. When I started writing both Digital Democracy and Traveling While Black, I had it in my mind that I wanted both books to be explicitly feminist in method and in practice. As you heard, I studied in some of the most traditional staid universities in the world. I remember distinctly there was a political theory, introduction to political theory, first year political science. And we studied in one go, feminism, environmentalism, post-colonialism in the same lecture, 30-minute lecture, and that was about it. There were no further explicit encounters with any of those things, just the taste that there's something you can do with this feminism stuff, I guess, if you want to. For the remaining 3 years, feminism was never explicitly mentioned again. The idea of feminism as a marginal or a specialist concern is something that never really sat right with me. When I set out to produce my own work, it was something that I wanted to challenge. I wanted to go back to that myself as a first year, hearing that thing very quickly and resetting it and making it the thematic focus, whether I was thinking about elections or conflict or finances or banking. What can feminism as a method apply to all of these different thematic focuses? When I started, I was very unsure and very overwhelmed. I didn't know where to start looking because, as I said, I hadn't really been pointed towards African feminist work throughout my own academic life. Really, what was the saving grace was the community of African feminists that I managed to find online. People who were able to speak to me, who out of their own generosity, of their own time said, you know what, take a look at the work that was done by this person. Look up the work that was done by that person. There's a community of practice that African feminists have built just by finding each other across geographies and across time zones even, where we're in constant conversation with each other and trying to build each other's work up. And I'm happy to report that 3 years later, the work has been very well received. The conversations that have flowed from it have been very inspiring and very revelatory. And the idea of African feminism as a method has become standard to my own work. And I think to anybody who tries to do any work with me. So in this talk, I'm going to be sharing with you some of the things that I've learned from this experience, the notes on what eventually became the how of doing feminist political science. First, some definitions. From the outset, I want to make it very clear that there is no single way, there's no one way of being an African. There's no single way of being an African woman. The plural is deliberate. Feminism, yes, is the idea, fundamental idea that people of all genders are created equal or should have equal opportunities. But the factors that trigger that inequality, of course, will vary from society to society. Women will experience patriarchy along different axes, either in the domestic or the public domain, across generations, across religions, race, sexual orientations. As varied and insidious as patriarchy is, so too is resistance to it. African feminisms are post-colonial feminisms found in Africa. Pinky Megwe reminds us that the post in post-colonial is by definition multiplicitous. It has different faces because of the varied ways in which colonialism was experienced. Colonial power is ordered differently depending on the different societies, because the objectives of domination are different, right? Indirect rule, if we're colonizing this space just to prove that we can. Direct rule, if our goal is extraction. What kind of extraction? Is it a resource that can be carried across the territory? Is it a resource that we have to have control over the territory in order to exploit? All of these concerns generate different relationships to the colonized territory. And as a result, all of these different relationships produce different reactions to it. Hence the varied faces of African feminisms and post-colonial feminisms. The idea of African feminism is not about flattening African women's experience. It's not about saying that this is the one correct way to be an African feminist. Feminism as an intellectual practice is so much more demanding than that. It asks for solidarity that crosses both time and space, histories and geographies. It's about allowing the specific in the general, finding that which is human in people who exist in different forms than we do. African feminism is hard work. So with this in mind, my primary goal when doing feminist research in the digital age has been tracking women's work through various digital platforms, on the internet, behind the scenes, the women who build the tech that we use. What are women doing in the digital age? What are African women doing in the digital age? Why are they doing it? How are they doing it? With whom are they doing it? The basics have been trying to find African women's political agency, and it's not difficult to find, and reflecting on the methods that would allow me to do that. With the same tools that I use to think about elections and big men and all of that apply when I'm trying to figure out how women mobilize in response to gendered threats of violence in the CBD. They don't. For me, it's about finding women's work and developing a consciousness as a researcher to understand it properly in its own context. I want to highlight 3 choices that I made specifically with regards to digital democracy that underscore what I'm talking about here. First, as I mentioned, shifting the central referent object away from the masculine towards the feminine and looking out for where women's work lives. How do women use mobile money? This is one of the most interesting little tidbits because they were doing research on how women use mobile money in Kenya and found that the vast majority of small and medium enterprises in Kenya are owned by women, small kiosks, women who are doing day trading and all of that. And they would borrow money in the morning, trade with it the whole day, and then pay off the loan at the end of the day so that it doesn't incur interest and keep the balance of the profits for the business. And this drives a high volume of transactions, right? Because every time you do that, you have to pay the transactional costs. But at the same time, the women were not incurring the high penalties of keeping the loans open. Some of these loan rates are usurious. You would have 34% interest rate for a loan that you borrowed for 30 days. So being able to play that cycle is something that market women have done to reconcile the high cost of mobile loans with the demand that they have for short-term credit. These are things that you wouldn't ordinarily find if you didn't ask women, if you didn't find what work women were doing and how women were using the internet. How do women define community online? How do they build and sustain movements online? The way in which Kenyan women have organized the Justice for campaigns, My Dress, My Choice, these movements have given shape to the internet, social media especially, as a place where Kenyan politics happens. And part of this is obviously a reaction to women's concerns being silenced in the analog domain. And I don't want to go into great detail about that. It's in the book, no spoilers. But the overall idea is basically that because this existed as a site where organizing could still happen without the strong presence of the state, that women were able to find each other, speak to each other, and articulate these very urgent issues like safety, being able to dress however you choose online. The Justice for Khadija campaign was a campaign against gender-based violence that didn't have audience in the media. The second thing that I want to point you to is citation practice as feminist practice. whose voices do you seek out? Whose voices do you amplify? Whose concerns do you amplify? One of the things that I get a lot of questions about, especially in Kenya, is why didn't you write more about Raila and William Ruto and Uhuru Kenyatta, this trifecta of Kenyan big men? Why didn't you write more about them? Why do you write how can you write a book about politics that doesn't settle on what the big men are doing? And I said, well, I did. Because looking away from where the patriarchal power flows from, what interesting questions does that yield? And whose voices are you looking for when you're thinking about structuring an argument, a conversation around how power behaves in a specific society? We've long assumed that this is where the center of politics is in Kenya. And really what I wanted to underscore is that actually politics, in the broad definition of the word, as how power is allocated in a society, lives far beyond the concern of what the big men are doing. And you'll see even in the citation choices, what stories are interesting. The Justice For campaigns, My Dress, My Choice. Thinking critically about how communities being defined by these online conversations. They are deliberate choices made in whose conversation gets amplified. When you think about, as I said in the beginning, who gets to write about the internet? And this is a conversation that we're having right now. When the internet was first started, it was women, right, who were the virtual computer, who were the actual computers, who were doing the calculations, who were inputting the figures. And then we get to the 90s and suddenly the internet is this tech bro space and the women's stories have been written out of that history. You kind of have the same energy when you think about the criticism that's happening on the internet, whereby women like Sophia Noble and Ruha Benjamin and Shoshana Zuboff have been writing extensively about the internet for the last decade. And yet now that there's a realization that there's a big problem on our doorsteps, we're looking for the male experts to explain it to us, right? This is the kind of energy that's underlying that I wanted to write against, that there are voices out there. Brenda Sanya wrote extensively about mobile money long before people were thinking about mobile money as a site for political action in Kenya, right? And trying to highlight those voices and those conversations is a decision to amplify them as well. And finally, methodologically, oral histories, life histories as method. I can tell you, when I got to the end of this book, if there was anything in terms of methods that had been reinforced in me, it was the fact that life histories are really powerful feminist methods. That storytelling actually has really a lot of power to it because it allows you to make connections that maybe even the person who's giving you the data that you're using for your research hasn't realized that they need to make themselves. When you talk to the women on whose websites a lot of the foundational internet building or community building in Kenya happened, many of them don't immediately realize how important what they did was for creating this environment that made the political conversations possible later. The fact that Orio Kolo and Juliana Rotich and all of these women had this high profile on the internet long before social media became a common thing in the country meant that other women, younger women, other generations had someone that they could look up to and they could organize themselves around and makes political thinking, political organizing, something that's attractive in a way that it isn't necessarily in the analog space. So, in thinking about all of this, there's a couple of interesting conversations that connect more broadly to African women's political work in other spaces. For one thing, for women, you notice that there's a significant political potency in complaint. I've already talked about how the analog space can be very constraining for women in Kenya. When I was thinking about this point, I recalled the 1922 Thuku resistances in Kenya. This is something that's not even taught in Kenyan political science. If you bump into someone who maybe hasn't studied at PhD level, at master's level, African studies, they might not even be able to tell you that this happened. But in 1922, the Kenyan women, the leader of one of the key political resistances to colonialism in Kenya, Hari Thuku, was arrested and he was put in prison. And a group of people, men and women, gathered at the specific chief's camp to protest and ask that he be released. Initially, the men, the African men, were willing to negotiate with the chief and the home guards for the release of Harry Buku. Go home, we'll deal with this later. And it was a woman led by Mary Nanjala who stood up and said, "What are you doing? Why are you capitulating to this demand? Why don't you push back against this?" And using slurs, insults, all of these tactics that aren't really comprehensible to what we think political action is, in order to shame the chief into action. Unfortunately, what happened was that they opened fire on this crowd and killed the 3 women. So the very first martyrs in Nairobi at the anti-colonial movement were women, subsequently written out of the political history, or silenced in the political history. At least now there's a little bit of an effort to try and get more people in the country to be aware of this history. When you think about how digital discourse and how women online use complaint, there's a genealogy that you see that kind of goes back to this approach that the women use in the Buku resistances. There's an approach to complaint, to raising your voice, as Sarah Ahmed characterizes it, that there's echoes and resonances to that. Because the formal space doesn't necessarily make room for that kind of complaint. Oh, you're threatening, you're making noise at the president. That's the translation in my head. You're complaining to the president directly. That you can't do that. You can't gather outside the chief's camp. You can't gather outside parliament. That doesn't happen, right? But there's a way in which that acquires a potency online that to me has that echoes of what happened in 1922. There's a role, a politics to complaint that has been played there. Secondly, women's work often happens outside institutions. I've already mentioned Ori Okolo, Julian Narutich, and Ori's experience with Shahidi. Again, there's a deeper conversation in the book. But I think it's a really important insight into how women's work happens. During the heart of the 2007 post-election violence, Ori had a very popular blog in Kenya, kenyapundit.com. And she put out a call on her blog and she said, hey, wouldn't it be something important if we could have people find where there's a site of violence, text that information to a centralized database so that we could make a map and we could map all of the events that are happening and we could send first responders to them. Now, with the benefit of hindsight, we probably look at that and think, yeah, that makes perfect sense. In 2007, nobody was thinking that. In 2007, we were all thinking, no, you have to go and dial the number and get the police, and then the police will go and things like that. Nobody was really thinking about using the internet in that way. That informality, that happening on her blog, is the thing that subsequently became Ushahidi, which is today the #1 crisis mapping app in the world. It starts from a very informal conversation. It starts from a very extra-institutional conversation. It's not her job. The blog is not her job. Talking to people who are friends, organizing them, moving them towards a specific line of action. That's really how Kenyan women's radical organizing online still happens. The conversations are informal. They're networked, they're diffused. People find each other, they mobilize, they disappear once the cause has been addressed. The echoes of this in the way in which women's resistance to colonization has also happened. And I want to give the example here of the Abo women's rights of 1922. Again, a protest against colonization. They're protesting against the tax and the violence of the warrant officers against women especially. It was so poorly researched and understood for a very long time because these women organized and they protested for 4 months, refused to submit to colonial power. And the colonial officers who came to document it could not believe that they were being stymied by women. And so they went back and wrote about it as if it was completely overhyped. It never happened. It was not that big of a deal. But the women who were interviewed, who happened to be present, a lot of them were interviewed in the 1990s, 1980s, would tell a different story, that it was actually important. Imagine bringing a market to a standstill for 4 months. No businesses coming in, no businesses going out because we're resisting these violences against us. C.L.R. James once said, the only place where Africans did not revolt was in the history books of capitalist historians. Similarly, the only place where African women didn't organize against colonization is in the masculinist imagination of where political work happens. doesn't always happen in institutions, doesn't always happen in formal spaces. In fact, more often than not, it doesn't. And finally, one of the interesting threads that emerged for me in doing this work is African women's work is radical. I'm using radical in the formulation proposed by Ellis, getting to the root of the problem, not really spending time on the extraneous issues, but trying to get to what's the quickest solution, that way we can get to the solution here. When you track women's agency in the digital age, you get a sense of a constant yearning towards the fundamentals. How do we take apart the problem at its most fundamental and address it there? One thing that always comes up when thinking about politics, and you heard about the book, Where Women Are, one of the things that constantly came up is, why don't we see what women are doing? Why don't we see women at the polling stations? Why don't we see women on the ballot boxes? And this narrative that Kenyan women don't participate in politics. But one of the things that's become really apparent for me in thinking about the digital is, they're just defining politics in a much more radical way, as in getting to the root of the problem. How do I organize my community? How do I organize through my mosque? How do I organize through my church? How do I organize through my age set? And you see echoes of this in the digital conversation, not necessarily debating electoral politics and what the big men are doing, but how do we build a movement around safety? How do we build a movement around finding a shelter for this particular woman who's been affected by this really egregious form of violence? I think about this a lot in relation to the way women have instrumentalized shame online. Look, when you live in a society where institutions are by nature unresponsive, there's only so much you can do. You can write as many complaints as you want. You could even show up to the office and sit outside the office for 24 hours, and they won't respond to your complaint. Do whatever you want. We don't actually care. What the digital has done is it's created an avenue for pressure that wasn't really present in Kenya before. We can shame people into doing something. We can call them out by name. We can tag the president in our complaints. We can tag all of these political outfits in our complaints, and they have to respond because they want to protect the illusion of working, of doing something. Shame is a very powerful political instrument in Kenya. And it's a weapon that's most potently wielded by radical feminists. It's a weapon that is very specifically wielded in moments where it yields really important results. Again, I see echoes of this in past practices. You might have read about the Anlu practices of Cameroon, where when someone broke a social norm, the women in Northern Cameroon would organize themselves and really try to shame this person into changing their behavior. And shame is really important in societies where there is no carceral system. You know, in the West, we think as someone breaks the law, send them to jail. Kenya didn't have a police force until 1920. How did they keep order? How did they keep people in line? How did people who broke social norms get punished? Shame was a big part of this, right? Getting people to be embarrassed, ostracizing people for breaking the social norms. This practice, you see this in Cameroon, the Anlu example, you see it very clearly. They would literally show up at someone's house, break things, make a lot of noise, vulgarity, stripping, all of this stuff to let the person know that they were being ostracized until the person apologized. And then there was a cleanup effort, a reconciliation effort, we move on. I think this still happens a great deal in how people are responding to things online. The one thing that I haven't seen and I want to think more about is, where is the reconciliation? How do we close this loop? It's one thing to unleash all of this as an energy. It's another thing to close it. When you are unable to access formal institutions of power, shame is a powerful political tool. And Kenya's digital cultures have proven that it still really works for women. Amina Mama reminds us that feminist theory has always been derived from feminist politics. Feminism is not just about ideas. It's a new way of understanding the world. She invites us to reject the idea that theory is finished, that we're done with theory and all we have to do is keep using the theories that have already been established. With this in mind, this is what I want to propose, and this is derived from this experience of observing how African women use online, to propose an idea of African feminism as a method. When we see the practices of African feminism, we see, for one, that it's networked, right? Instead of the charismatic male figure who's going to lead us all into the promised land of freedom, we see people who are working in networks, in communities, in diffuse ways for a specific purpose, and then moving on. African feminism is intersectional. It doesn't just focus on the concerns of women, but it also thinks about the concerns of men, of LGBTQ+ people, gender and sexual minorities. African feminism, especially when you think about women who are thinking from the position of the mother figure, not in the physical sense of the word, but in the ideational sense of the word, thinking beyond the concerns of the self to the concerns of the community. And finally, African feminism is decolonial. And I emphasize decolonial rather than post-colonial, because post-colonial is a status. It's the status that we're achieving, it's the status that we're working towards. Whereas decolonial to me implies action, that African feminism is working towards undoing the colonial power dynamics that have been embedded in the way our societies are organized. What makes all of this analysis, all of this foregoing thinking African feminist is not because I'm an African. Even though there's nothing, I don't think there's anything wrong with bringing your subjectivities into your work. What makes this work African feminism is that it uses African women's political work as a starting point for developing a theory about power. And I found this to be a very useful approach. For one thing, it forces me to think outside disciplines. When you're shifting your central referent object away from who the person that assumes, for example, is the user of the internet, you can't use the same tools that you will on the new referent object. As Audre Lorde says, the master's tools will never destroy the master's house. You need a completely different set of tools. And that forces you to think outside the lines of discipline that you've created in your own work. And that's one of the reasons why African feminism as a method appeals to me. It forces me to use art. It forces me to use photography. It forces me to think with music. It forces me to think with all kinds of disciplines. And all of this enriches the work that comes out of it. I think it's useful to be able to look over the fence and see what others are doing in order to return to the fundamental goal of knowledge production, to move society forward. That's why we're doing all of this stuff. Not just to achieve the aspirations of the silos that we live in. So what then is African feminism as method? For me, it begins with a basic reinforcement. Political theory is about making sense of power relationships and disparities. And so African feminism as a method is an approach to theorizing politics and society that begins first by understanding that power is networked and is diffuse. It's not always situated within formal institutions. It's an intersectional approach that always considers how power impacts those who are most removed from it, those who have least access to formal institutions, and seeing their lived experiences as potent sites for analysis. And finally, it's a decolonial approach that always seeks to theorize and understand in a way that undoes disparities of power and inequality. African feminism is a method that can see the through line from the Thuku resistances, Anlu in Cameroon, Aba women's rights, to Wangari Maathai's youth protests, to queer visibility in the Rhodes Must Fall movement, to Stella Nyanzi's embrace of the violence, can see the line that connects all of these things. It's a method that deconstructs institutions and formalism in favor of usefulness and meaning without compromising rigor and generalizability. African feminism as a method is a way of thinking about power that looks away from formal institutions with which traditional political theory is accustomed to deal. Thank you.